As Americans, we are taught from an early age to value the study of history as a vital part of our education and our identity as a nation. Study of the American West has been extensive. The number of books published is second only to those written about the Civil War. But within all those volumes, references to African Americans are extremely rare. Today, historians are rediscovering the contributions of African Americans, recognizing their impact as a people, and exploring race relations as they played out in the Wild West. In this 5-part series, Professor Quinta Taylor focuses on African American history in terms of forming communities, combating racism, and changing social and political patterns in the development of the American West. The African American West is presented by the University of Washington's College of Arts and Sciences and the UW Alumni Association. Major funding for this program was provided by Macy's, continuing its long-term commitment to promoting Black history by making this video series available to secondary schools throughout Washington State. Additional funding was provided by the University Bookstore and UW-Medicine. The Civil War freed the slaves. It also opened vast tracts of land to settlement through the Homestead Act. In this talk, Professor Taylor looks at homesteaders, cowboys, and Buffalo soldiers and their journey to the West prior to 1900.
Good evening, and welcome to the second lecture in the series, The African American West, 1528 to 2000. I am Emile Petrie, Associate Vice President for the Office of Minority Affairs at the University of Washington. Tonight's lecture is entitled, To the Frontier, Homesteaders, Cowboys, and Buffalo Soldiers Search for Freedom in the West. Our concept of the frontier will be challenged by the information you hear tonight. The word frontier has several definitions. One is a region that forms the margin of settled and developed territory. Another is a line of division between different or opposed things. Tonight's lecture will include both of these meanings as Dr. Taylor shares information about frontiers that we have not heard before. This summer, Dr. Taylor traveled to a different frontier at the request of the U.S. State Department. In a distant city called Ekaterinburg, which is the home of Boris Yeltsin and the location where the Tsar was killed during the Russian Revolution. A U.S. consulate saw Dr. Taylor's website and found valuable and relevant information on that region. After perusing the vignettes of famous and not so famous African Americans, he asked Quinta to share his research with people of various cultures who reside east of the Ural Mountain Range. The region is a multiracial area blending ethnicities of European and Asian culture. During his visit, Dr. Taylor gave 14 presentations at 10 universities within 10 days. This presentation must feel easy compared to that undertaking. He spoke to many different people, mostly through translators, on the same subject he is exploring with you in this series. You know, it is wonderful to know that the University of Washington is being represented by Dr. Taylor in assisting the blending of cultures in Siberia and other parts of the world. Now let me welcome our speaker. Please help me welcome Professor Quinta Taylor.
Thank you, Emile, for that introduction. And Emile made reference to the website, and I have to apologize for a faux pas from last week. I was supposed to share with you this website. I was supposed to show you what we were attempting to do in terms of providing background information, and so I'm going to do that presently. Here we go. Okay. And you click on here, African American History in the West. Go down to vignettes of significant people and places in the West. I'm very proud of all of these. These are essentially short descriptions, and I'll pull up one. Short descriptions of African Americans in the American West, and they have been provided, if I can get this over, they have been provided by various historians across the nation. Let's see what comes up here. This is Barbara Behan. Barbara is at the University of Montana. She's an independent scholar working in Missoula. We have asked, and people have agreed to do this, we've asked over 100 historians, and these are the people, and you can see some familiar faces. These are the people who've already agreed to contribute vignettes and have vignettes up on the site. And they represent a cross-section of historians. Historians from major universities, graduate students, independent historians, people from historical societies, and on and on and on. All of them share in common a love of African American history, particularly in the West, and they've written vignettes to reflect on that love. And so I'm really moved by the fact that these folks have all volunteered to help. One other thing, this is a bibliography on the African American West. You have a shortened version of the bibliography, but this is a longer one for those who are interested. And primary documents. These are primary documents that are available. They are available to you. They're available to literally anybody in the world. These are the documents that attracted the people in Russia, along with the vignettes, and prompted them to say, Quinta Taylor ought to come to Siberia. So I urge you, I urge you, well, maybe that's not a recommendation here, but I urge you to take a look at these, and when you get home. I'm very proud of this website, and I'm most proud of the fact that most of this was done not by me, but by volunteers. Okay, let's begin the presentation for tonight, because we've actually got a lot to cover. We talked last time about the paradox of slavery and freedom in the West. We talked about the fact that African Americans literally had their freedom challenged, even in places like California and certainly in places like Texas. The Civil War comes in 1861, and by 1865, the shackles of slavery are finally broken. By 1865, all black folks are theoretically free, except that there is still a question as to what freedom means for all of these African Americans who've been enslaved. 90%, let's put it in context, 90% of the black population was enslaved until 1865. Now, that 90% could not travel to the West on their own before 1865. In 1865, though, theoretically, they have the ability to move anywhere in the country, including the American West. And yet, they don't come immediately. And the reason they don't come immediately is because one important question still needs to be resolved in this region. And that question is whether or not there will be full and extensive political rights, civil rights, extended to these people in this area of the country. Black Westerners knew that there was a Reconstruction process going on in the South. And of course, we're all very much familiar with Reconstruction in the South. But they also understood that they had disabilities of their own. I show this first image. These are black San Franciscans proudly participating in the city's 4th of July celebration. This is the first time they've done so. They see this as an acknowledgement of the fact that they are becoming part of the body politic. But yet there are problems. Yet there are disabilities, and I want to talk about those disabilities. Black Westerners in the period between 1865 and 1870 were denied a whole host of basic rights. They were denied the right to vote. They were denied the right to serve in the state militias. They were excluded from public schools in virtually every area of the West, whether that area had been slave or free before. They were excluded from the jury box. They were excluded from public transportation and accommodations. In other words, Western blacks face many of the same, no, let me strike that, most of the same disabilities as blacks in the South. We might think of the West as a place that's different, a place where there's greater opportunity, but that opportunity wasn't present at least in 1865. There was a question of whether or not rights would be extended to African Americans, even in this region. As San Francisco newspaper editor Philip A. Bell declared in July of 1865, "We have removed slavery, which gave out evidence of our woe. America, of course, has no slave within her domain." And then he warned, "She must have no disenfranchised citizen beneath the shadow of her flag." What he didn't realize when he said that in 1865 was that there would be a tremendous struggle that would be waged in California for the next 5 years to eventually get blacks the right to vote. Notice I said in California. This is not the Deep South. We all know about the struggles that were going to be waged in the Reconstruction South. But in California, in Oregon, in other states and territories in the West, there would be a challenge to the idea of full black citizenship rights, full black participation in the body politic. Now, in an area as diverse as the West, as we've said before, there are going to be a variety of responses to African Americans. To some extent, those responses are predicated on the level of population, but not necessarily. There are some places that are going to clearly be more advanced or more sympathetic, let's put it like this, more sympathetic to the extension of black rights than others. For example, Nevada becomes the first state in the nation to ratify the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote. And the Nevadans are still very, very proud of that. Example number two, and this is an example of the beginning of a political struggle that will last, in some ways, well into the 20th century. In Texas, 20 white men, mostly former plantation owners, and 150 black men, mostly ex-slaves, gathered together in Houston on July 4th, 1867, and at that august meeting, at that very important meeting, they created the Texas Republican Party. Folks, that's the party of George W. Bush. That's the party of K. Bailey Richardson. That's the party of a whole host of Tom DeLay, my God. I've always wondered, let me make an aside here, I've always wondered when these people meet and have when the Republicans, the Texas Republicans meet and have their annual conventions, do they have the pictures of these men who founded the party? I suspect not. I suspect even they don't realize the very interesting and ironic history of their own party. But let me bring us back to the local area. There were at least some in Washington Territory who supported the idea of full suffrage. This is the Olympia Commercial Age, a newspaper, a white newspaper in Olympia, and this is what they wrote in 1870. I won't read all of it to you, but essentially they say, and I'll read the last paragraph, "It will be a happy day for the country when the people shall no more care to inquire whether a voter or a candidate for office is white or black than whether he is tall or short." In other words, those were important words to live by in 1870, and we haven't quite gotten to that point even to this day. Of course, one of the reasons we haven't gotten to that point is because there was significant opposition to black voting. Let me show you these two quotes, and these are from papers in the West. Again, this is not the South responding to black voting. This is the Oregonian in Portland, and this is the Sacramento Bee. And they are clearly showing their opposition to African American voting in the West, and indeed anywhere in the country. Nonetheless, African Americans are going to begin to challenge for their civil rights. Regardless of what people say, regardless of whether people say they should have these rights, black people are of the mind that these rights are given to them by God, not by the human population. And as a result, they are going to be destined to share in the political liberties of everyone else in the country. Let me give you an example of this. And I will suggest to you that there is a political campaign, there is a civil rights campaign that begins in the West very early on. Indeed, I argue that it begins in the 1860s, the early 1860s, when the nation itself is still involved in the Civil War. Let me give you an example. In 1862, a 19-year-old San Francisco African-American woman named Charlotte Brown became California's Rosa Parks. What I mean by that is that she was ejected from a San Francisco streetcar because of her race. In other words, she was not allowed to ride on the streetcar because of her race. She decided to protest. She decided to challenge. She didn't organize a bus boycott, but she did do the next best thing. She filed a lawsuit. And she brought the suit against the Omnibus Company in San Francisco. And there was a jury trial, and the jury eventually deliberated, and they gave her just 5 cents as an award. They said that she was discriminated against, but they gave her only 5 cents as an award for that discrimination. 3 days later, she went back out. She attempted to ride the streetcar again. Again, she was ejected, and she almost knew this was going to happen, and she brought a second lawsuit. This lawsuit was going to eventually result in $3,000 in damages, which was a huge sum of money at that time. And essentially, she thought that she had won her case. 5 weeks later, she attempts to ride the omnibus streetcar again, and despite the verdict, despite the earlier verdict, she is pushed off the streetcar. This time, she files suit for a third time, and only on the third time is she finally allowed to ride. Only in the third time is the company forced to admit that it will open its doors, literally open its cars to everyone. I use this example to suggest that there is a debate that's going on all over the West. Now, this is actually what I call an anti-desegregation cartoon. Essentially, there are a lot of whites or European Americans in San Francisco who were upset with the judge's decision when he ruled in her favor, and with the jury's decision as well in an earlier case. And so there's contestation. In other words, even in a place like San Francisco, one is not exactly sure of his or her rights if one is African Americans. Nonetheless, I think this example shows that black people could effectively organize the struggle for those rights. That Charlotte Brown was not by herself, that indeed there were going to be hundreds, if not thousands of people, and black mostly, but also including whites in California who would aid her in her campaign to try to break segregation on the streetcars. Black Californians would soon be joined in that struggle by African Americans who were residing about 2,000 miles away in Kansas. In 1866, this is just after the Civil War, this is just after slavery had officially ended, black Kansans organized themselves to demand their civil rights, to demand full civil rights for themselves in their new state. They meet in 1866 in Lawrence, Kansas, and there they challenged the widely held notion that black voting was a privilege which the white male electorate could confer or deny at its pleasure. Their argument was simple. These are natural rights, quote unquote. This is some of the language of the 19th century, and therefore no electorate can determine who will have the right to vote. And then they add something else, and I'm not going to read, well, I'll read part of it to you. They add this very, very powerful statement, as you can see above. They say, we must be a constant trouble in this state until it extends to us equal and exact justice. Folks, these were very, very powerful words. I thought I was reading the words of Malcolm X when I first saw this. We must be a constant trouble in this state until it extends to us equal and exact justice. These were words that were written by African Americans who were determined to gain their freedom, their total freedom, in 1866 in Kansas. Black Westerners' campaign for suffrage would have national implications in the neighboring territory of Colorado. Let me try to explain the backdrop here, and I'll get to this man in a minute. In 1860, when Colorado Territory was organized, African American men actually had the right to vote. In 1864, the vote was taken from them, for reasons we won't get into now, but in 1864, the vote was denied them. In 1865, African Americans, and they only numbered about 150 people in the entire territory of Colorado, and Colorado only had about 20,000 people. Those 150 African Americans, mostly male, there were only about 20% of the population that was female, those African Americans decided to mount a campaign, wage a campaign to regain, notice I didn't say gain, to regain the suffrage rights that had been taken away or that had been denied them. The leader of this campaign was William Jefferson Hardin. Hardin was a barber by trade, but he was also a politician, and fortunately for the people in Colorado, he was a person who had gotten to know Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner. And I've always said that if you're a black person in America, it's always good to know a Massachusetts senator. And William Hardin was able to use, or if you will, exploit that connection to get in. He would become the leader of the campaign to regain suffrage for African Americans in Colorado. And he would, in 1866, send a letter to Senator Charles Sumner, a letter and a telegram to Senator Charles Sumner in Washington, D.C., to his congressional office, describing what was going on in Colorado and asking the senator from Massachusetts to oppose statehood for Colorado until it restores voting rights for African American men. In other words, he was literally going to hold statehood hostage. He and these other blacks were going to hold statehood hostage until black rights were going to be, until black rights were going to be restored. And of course, you can see here the part of the statement that he makes in that famous telegram. Slavery went down in a great deluge of blood, and I greatly fear that unless the American people learn from the past to do justice now and in the future, that their cruel prejudices will go down in the same blood. This statement was made less than 2 years after the Civil War had ended. 2 years after there had been the bloodiest conflict in the history of the country, and yet these issues were unresolved. At least as far as Hardin was concerned, these issues were unresolved, and they had to be resolved before there would be full peace. Senator Sumner agreed. He read the telegram from the black barber from Denver, Colorado, before the U.S. Senate, the entire U.S. Senate, and then he publicly declared his opposition to Colorado statehood. And because of his stance, eventually there were enough Republicans, enough people in the Senate who refused to allow Colorado to come into the Union at that point. But this is not the end of the story. There were Republicans at the national level who were so upset at what was going on in Colorado, at the denial of voting rights, that in 1867, in January 1867, Congress passed the Territorial Suffrage Act. The Territorial Suffrage Act would extend voting rights to black males in all of the territories of the United States, including Colorado Territory. And to show you the significance of this, the importance of this, I want you to understand the order in which voting rights are going to be extended. Voting rights come first to blacks in Washington, D.C. in 1866. They come secondly to the blacks in the territories, partly because of Hardin's efforts in 1866 and 1867. Thirdly, they will come to blacks in the South as a consequence of Reconstruction. And then finally, with the 15th Amendment, they will be extended to African American males, at least, throughout the country. So indeed, African Americans in Colorado, African Americans in the West, were not sort of coming up behind or bringing up the rear in terms of the struggle. They were very much in the forefront in terms of what would become, or what was already, a national struggle to bring about civil rights and voting rights for African American males. With the question of voting rights settled in all of the West, with the exception of Texas, and Texas is always the grand exception. You're going to see me coming back to this over and over again. With the exception of Texas, the voting rights question is settled. And as a result, African Americans theoretically have the ability to come to the West. Theoretically, they can come to the West and try to achieve freedom. These are black citizens of Helena, Montana. Yeah, I know, a lot of people don't even realize there were black citizens in Helena, Montana, but these are black citizens in Helena, Montana, celebrating the ratification of the 15th Amendment in April of 1870, even though the black citizens of Helena, Montana, and other areas of Montana, because Montana is a territory, have been voting since 1867. But once the amendment is passed, once the 15th Amendment is ratified, then they understand that voting rights for all black people across the country are guaranteed. But as I said before, there's still a question. There's still a large question looming. What is going to be the reaction to those blacks who come to the West? What is going to be the reaction? Will those blacks be extended freedom in this area of the country? These are blacks making their way to the West. And let me show you two responses. The first one is the Topeka colored citizen. Obviously, they have a self-interest in mind. They certainly want African Americans to come to the West. And notice what they say here. come to the West, come to Kansas, and Kansas looms very large, as you're going to find out in a minute, in order that you may be free from the persecution of the rebels. If blacks come here and starve, all well, it is better to starve to death in Kansas than to be shot and killed in the South. This was a powerful sentiment on the part of African Americans. But on the other hand, look at the forerunner of the Seattle PI. And they argue that there shouldn't be very many African Americans in the West, and certainly very, very few in the Pacific Northwest. And notice the reference to the Chinese. In other words, the West already has a, quote, racial problem in the minds of a lot of these people, and it would only be compounded by adding African Americans. Nonetheless, despite what the PI says, or the Seattle Daily Intelligentsia says, black people will come. Black people will come. On a 1,000-mile frontier stretching from Dakota to Oklahoma, they sought out the region that they hoped would provide both freedom and opportunity. And notice I juxtaposed those two terms last time, and I will continue to do so. Black people who come west are looking for economic opportunity. They're looking to try to prosper, but they're also looking for a kind of political freedom that seemingly does not exist in the South or in other areas of the country. And they particularly turn to Kansas in the 1860s and increasingly in the 1870s. And they turned to Kansas for a couple of reasons. I want to leave this map up for a while. They turned to Kansas for a couple of reasons, reasons that are both political and psychological. Let me give you the reasons. First, Kansas offers potential homesteaders, regardless of race, access to vast tracts of yet-to-be-developed farmland. Folks, in 19th century America, the greatest way to wealth, or at least what was perceived as the greatest way to wealth, was land ownership. And people all over the country wanted to access the land. And what better way than the homestead land in the West? The 1862 Homestead Law, which applied to Kansas and other western states and territories, was uncomplicated and unambiguous. The federal government, according to this law, would provide 160 acres of land to any settler who paid a $12 filing fee and resided on and improved the land over 5 years. However, after 6 months, the settler could purchase the land outright for $1.25 per acre. Where can you get land in America for $1.25 an acre a day? I mean, this was a huge giveaway. This was, I don't want to get into this in any detail, but this was a huge advantage for those who were going to be able to homestead. Now, that's not to say that everybody had good land. Everybody would receive great land in the West. There were bad lands that were homesteaded as well, and there were a lot of people who failed to make the land work or make the land productive. And of course, that's something that has to be taken into consideration. But there were tens of thousands, no, maybe even millions of people who were going to gain homesteads. And from those homesteads, they would derive a basis for wealth. Secondly, Kansas was completely dominated at that moment, and probably still is, by the Republican Party. The Republican Party was extremely important in the minds of African Americans at that point because the political roles of the parties were completely reversed from today, for those of you who may not be familiar with. The Republican Party, as Frederick Douglass said, was the ship, and all else was the sea. And what he meant by that was that the Republican Party was the only major political party, only one of the major political parties that was dedicated to African American rights and African American advancement. The Democrats were just the opposite. And indeed, in some ways, those positions have been reversed today. But I will tell you that the Democrats, particularly the Democrats in the South, were much worse than anything that we see taking place today. As a matter of fact, you don't have to be reminded, I hope you don't have to be reminded of the political situation in the South in the 1870s. There was Reconstruction. You all remember that from your general U.S. history courses. You all know that Reconstruction ended formally in 1877. And it was assumed that since blacks were no longer a political factor, that would be the end of the violence directed against them. There had been tremendous violence against blacks during Reconstruction. That violence didn't stop. That violence continued after 1877, and eventually it would prompt a lot of black folks to leave various areas of the South. Indeed, that violence doesn't stop until well into the 20th century. And I would argue that even as I talk about the lure of the West, we always have to keep in mind, we always have to remember the fact that blacks are being propelled out of the South by the racial violence that's taking place. Kansas looked like the place where they wouldn't have to worry about that racial violence because there were people in charge in Kansas who seemingly were politically favorably disposed to them. When a St. Louis Globe reporter asked the woman, these are people who are headed to Kansas. These are, if you will, refugees. These aren't just people who are trying to settle new lands, although that's certainly part of it. But they are also people who are fleeing oppression in the South. And I'll give you one example of this in a minute. When a St. Louis Globe reporter asked a woman with a child at her breast in 1879 if she would return to the South or go on to Kansas, and she had a very quick response. What? Go back to the South? I'd sooner starve. Go back to the South? I'd sooner starve. Let me give you another example of this. I don't have a slide that really reflects it, but John Solomon Lewis. John Solomon Lewis was a typical, if we can use that word, a typical sharecropper in northeastern Louisiana. He brought in crops every year. He got further and further in debt. And eventually, by 1879, he decided, I've had enough of this. I'm taking my family and we're leaving. And in order to leave, he had to secret himself and his family into the swamp and wait for weeks until a riverboat came along to pick him up. And once that riverboat did show up and he boarded the boat, and the captain said, where do you want to go? What's your destination? He uttered one word, Kansas, Kansas. And what he meant by that was that Kansas was this place that represented freedom for him and his family. And that brings me to the third point as to why Kansas was significant, was indeed almost unique in the minds of African Americans at that particular moment. Kansas was the state where the abolitionist tradition seemed to loom large. It was the place where John Brown first took direct action to try to destroy the institution of slavery, and where, as we said last week, John Brown and other white men rode into Missouri and actually freed slaves, as many slaves as they could. Kansas was the first northern state to enlist African Americans as soldiers in the Army of the United States. Kansas supported the Emancipation Proclamation. It was one of the first states to publicly say that they supported Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And it was one of the first states, I think it was the third state, in fact, to ratify the 13th Amendment, which destroyed the institution of slavery. Kansas, however, by the 1870s would become a place of refuge, not just for black folks, not just in the minds of black folks. There would be Europeans who would come, people who would come from Germany and Poland and Russia, and who would make their way to the Kansas Plains because they saw Kansas as a place of refuge and opportunity. So when blacks said we want to come to Kansas and we want to settle on the Kansas frontier, in effect, they were doing much what everyone else, or much what millions of other people were doing when they looked to Kansas and looked to the American West. As a matter of fact, there's one person who said when he was challenged by someone as to why he and other blacks would go to the frontier, and they said, why would you do so? And he said, that's what white men go to new countries for, isn't it? You don't tell them to stay behind because they are poor. The Homestead Act was made for poor people. And so I want you to see the faces of some of these people who were making their way west. And many of them, or I shouldn't say many of them, but a subset of them would go to the place that would become famous even in the 1870s and 1880s as a place of refuge and settlement for African Americans. And that place was Nicodemus, Kansas. They would follow their brethren to Kansas, and they would end up in Nicodemus. I won't give you all of the background on Nicodemus, except to say that it was actually founded by W.R. Hill, who was a white land speculator, but he decided that he wanted to create an area of refuge for African Americans and make a little bit of money at the same time. And as a result, he contacted 6 African Americans, interestingly, all from Lexington, Kentucky, or all had a background in Lexington, Kentucky. And they, in turn, began to contact others as they set up or they established the Nicodemus Town Company. The Nicodemus Town Company was established in 1877. And at that time, it was on the frontier. At that time, it was about as far west, maybe even farther west than most of the settlement in Kansas at that time. They named their community Nicodemus after a legendary African slave prince who had managed to buy his freedom. They chose to locate their colony on the Solomon River. In other words, they felt that they almost had a biblical imprimatur as they moved to the west. These first settlers had to bring others, had to encourage others to come as well, had to encourage others to follow. And so they wrote back home. They wrote to Lexington, Kentucky, and in July of 1877, the first group of settlers arrived in Nicodemus, and they were followed in March of 1878 by more settlers. These people from Kentucky mostly, but eventually they would come from Tennessee and other areas. These people from Kentucky had no idea of what they would find. Indeed, Graham County, and more specifically Nicodemus, the area around Nicodemus at that time, was flat, barren, windswept. It was considered the worst of the worst land in Kansas. And most people didn't think that anybody would be able to grow wheat in this very stubborn land. African Americans, of course, rose to the occasion, they rose to the challenge and attempted to try to create a new life for themselves. Let me give you an example of some of the first of the settlers who come. This is Willie Hickman. We know about her only because she wrote down her experiences a little bit later on. She had a very difficult time in Nicodemus. Notice what she said. When she got to the horizon and her husband said, "There's Nicodemus," she said, "I looked with all the eyes I had. Where's Nicodemus? Where's Nicodemus? I don't see it." And I will say, as a footnote to all of this, that Willie Hickman eventually got over her initial shock. She became one of the people who stayed, and she became part of a prominent family that lives in Nicodemus to this day. But the initial reaction was certainly, I think, one that was frightening for her as she reached the West Kansas plains. Nicodemus became the first predominantly black town to receive national attention. And by that, I mean the New York Times a reporter came out and covered the story. And once you make the New York Times, then you do get national coverage. And essentially, there was a lot of attention that was going to be focused on Nicodemus. But there would be, and we don't have time to talk about all of them, but there would be other towns that would be created in Kansas, and far more of these towns that would be established in Oklahoma and the Indian Territory, and even, a little bit later on, even some in California and Arizona and Nevada. In other words, throughout the West, there would be African Americans who would try to establish towns or agricultural colonies where they could both prosper economically, but as importantly, where they could be free, where they could sense that they could have political rights as well. The best way to describe Oklahoma is to talk about the fact that this was at one time all Indian country. All of this area that we see on the map here as Oklahoma belonged to the 5 nations. The Civil War, unfortunately, prompts the federal government to take away more than half of that land. And for a while, that land, the western part of the area, which will become the Oklahoma Territory proper, the western part of that area is given over to other Native American groups. But there's increasing pressure from settlers in Kansas, settlers in Texas, settlers in Arkansas to open up this land, since the Indians, since there are relatively few Indians on the land. And eventually Congress succumbs to that pressure. And in 1889, the first of a series of runs will be made on Oklahoma. In other words, Oklahoma will be opened up to settlement by non-Indians. For African Americans, Oklahoma wasn't simply an opportunity for settlement. It wasn't simply an opportunity to get a homestead. It was also, for one brief moment, a possibility for achieving political freedom. The leader of that movement to try to achieve that political freedom was Edwin P. McCabe. Edwin McCabe was an interesting character, at least to me he was an interesting character. He was born in Troy, New York. He was one of the first blacks to work on the stock market in the 1850s. And he was essentially a boy runner on the stock market. By the 1870s, he was in Kansas. By 1882, he became the auditor, the state auditor for Kansas. That is, he was the highest elected state official outside of the African-American official, at least, outside of the American South. And I think at the time, he was about 32 years old. He was certainly the youngest black elected official at the state level. McCabe appeared to have a very bright future in Kansas, but he coupled that future with Nicodemus. That is, he lived in Nicodemus. He had gone to Nicodemus. And unfortunately, as Nicodemus declined, McCabe decided to look for other opportunities. And the closest opportunities were in neighboring Oklahoma, in the Oklahoma Territory. Now, there's an argument that McCabe attempted to try to create Oklahoma Territory as an all-black territory, or tried to transform it into an all-black territory, tried to get himself appointed governor and hopefully create an all-black state. I think that's part of the myth of McCabe and the movement at the time. But McCabe did believe, he did sincerely believe, that Oklahoma was west of the South. He did believe that Oklahoma could provide an opportunity for African Americans as both economic and political. Notice what he says here. Oklahoma is the paradise of Eden and the garden of the gods, and on and on and on. I mean, there's a lot of this hyperbole. And let's be very clear on this. McCabe is a typical booster. And by booster, I mean he's a guy who has land, he wants to bring other people out, he wants to get them to buy the land, and as they buy the land, he will get wealthy. But he's also doing something else. He also is urging the blacks in the South to come west in the hope that they will find freedom. He also offers up Oklahoma as a place where they can get west of racism, where they can get west of discrimination, where they can go beyond, if you will, the kinds of perils that were going on. And for some blacks, Oklahoma would become that land of potential opportunity. Now, again, you have to understand this against the backdrop of things happening elsewhere. 1892. At the time, just about the time he's promoting Oklahoma, there's a terrible race riot in Memphis. A number of people were killed. And Ida B. Wells, who eventually will emerge, if she's not already, as a major leader, a major spokesman for African Americans, inadvertently aids McCabe when she says black folks ought to quit Memphis, they ought to leave Memphis and go to Oklahoma. And as a result, more and more African Americans will begin to move west. They will begin to come to Oklahoma. And of course, McCabe will try to promote this as much as he can because he believes that Oklahoma is going to be the place for the future for African Americans. He will create Langston City in Oklahoma. Langston City will be an all-black city. He's very proud of the fact that it's an all-black city. He talks about the fact that it has black teachers, it has a black mayor, and all the rest. And he says this is an example of political power. This is an example, a manifestation of black political power, and most importantly, black self-determination at a time when African Americans see their rights being restricted all over the country. But he knows that creating one town is not enough, that he has to attract farmers, and to that end, he begins to turn to the next possibility of settlement, the Cherokee Strip. The Cherokee Strip is a vast area, a vast territory just to the west of Langston City. And McCabe, as early as 1891, and certainly by 1892, he's calling for people to come to the west. Here's the quote. Everyone that can should go to the Strip and get 160, meaning 160 acres. All you need is a Winchester, a frying pan, and the $15 filing fee. This is McCabe in the Langston City Herald. Now, this is a drawing. This is a very famous drawing from the library, the state library at Oklahoma. And it's a drawing depicting whites. But in point of fact, McCabe was going to be successful in getting about 2,000 African Americans, men and women, to participate in the land rush into the Cherokee Strip. And at the end of the day, and notice this is not just a metaphor, people who came to Oklahoma and in these land rushes were able to stake claims. Usually, the land rush started at 12 noon. By 6 p.m., they were able to stake their claim. At the end of that day, that is at 6 p.m., 1,000 African-American farmers had established their claims to land in Oklahoma, or at least in that part of Oklahoma. Now, many of you may detect a certain irony here. Black folks and white folks are taking lands that have been owned by Indians before, lands that have been promised to the Indians forever. But nonetheless, that was part of the process that was going on in Oklahoma at that time. As one African-American said, and he summarized the opening in 1892 this way.